Imagine walking into a restaurant, expecting a fine dining experience, only to be treated like you don't belong. Now, what if the man being ignored was actually the owner? When this undercover CEO walked into his own restaurant, he was ready for a quiet meal, but what he witnessed instead made his blood run cold. And that was just the beginning. The hum of conversation and the soft clinking of silverware filled the air inside Le Grand Luxe, one of the most exclusive restaurants in New York City. The restaurant was a sanctuary for the elite, a place where deals were sealed over vintage wine and where the service was as polished as the marble floors. Tonight, Richard Grant sat alone at a corner table near the entrance, his presence unnoticed, exactly as he intended. As the founder of Le Grand Luxe, Richard rarely made public appearances at his own establishments. He preferred to operate behind the scenes, ensuring the restaurants maintained the standards that had made them renowned. But lately, whispers of favoritism in service had reached his ears. Complaints buried under layers of bureaucracy. He needed to see it for himself. The evening unfolded smoothly at first. Waiters glided across the dining room, catering to impeccably dressed patrons who barely acknowledged their presence. Bottles of Bordeaux were uncorked. Dishes of seared foie gras and lobster thermidor arrived at tables with precision. Richard observed, waiting for something to stand out. Then, they walked in, an elderly couple, dressed modestly, James and Eleanor Carter. He in a neatly pressed navy blazer, she in a soft wool cardigan. Their eyes carried the warmth of decades spent together. And yet, as they stepped inside, uncertainty flickered across their faces. They had the look of people who felt out of place but carried themselves with quiet dignity. James approached the hostess, a tall young woman with a rehearsed smile. He spoke politely, mentioning a reservation made a week ago. The hostess glanced at the reservation book, her eyes scanning the pages before landing on their name. Then, her expression shifted, just slightly. But enough. I'm sorry, sir, but there's a bit of a wait tonight, she said smoothly, flipping the page before James could question her. We'll have a table ready as soon as possible. James glanced around. There were empty tables scattered throughout the restaurant, beautifully set, waiting. Yet, instead of being led to one, he and Eleanor were guided to a small bench near the entrance. They sat down without complaint, but Richard caught the way James shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening over his wife's. A few minutes later, the door swung open, and a group of 4 entered, dressed in designer suits and cocktail dresses. Laughter spilling into the restaurant before they even reached the hostess stand. This time, there was no hesitation. Right this way, the hostess said, her voice bright, almost eager. Within seconds, a waiter materialized, pulling out chairs, presenting menus, pouring water. A manager, David Langston, stepped in personally to greet them, ensuring they received every courtesy. Richard's grip on his glass tightened. Across the room, a young waitress named Emma hesitated near the entrance. Glancing at the waiting couple, she took a step toward them. But before she could speak, David caught her eye and gave a small shake of his head. It was subtle, but clear. Leave them be. She hesitated. Then, reluctantly, she turned away. Richard leaned back, his eyes narrowing. He had seen enough. 45 minutes passed. The Carters remained in their place by the door, watching table after table fill around them. James finally stood, adjusting his blazer before approaching the hostess again. Excuse me, he said, his tone still polite but firmer now. We've been waiting quite a while. Are you sure there isn't a table available? David Langston appeared beside the hostess, his presence immediate, authoritative. He studied the couple as if seeing them for the first time. Then, with a carefully controlled smile, he spoke. I'm sorry, sir, but you'll have to wait a little longer. We prioritize our regular guests. James blinked, stunned by the bluntness. Eleanor reached for his arm, as if to calm him. For a moment, Richard thought the older man might argue. But instead, James inhaled deeply, exhaling through his nose, then gave a small nod and returned to his seat. Richard set his glass down. He had come tonight looking for answers. He had found them. Without revealing himself, he continued to watch, his expression unreadable, though his mind had already begun to turn. Richard Grant stepped out of Le Grand Luxe, the crisp night air cooling the simmering frustration that had settled in his chest. He walked at a steady pace, blending into the Manhattan crowd, his hands tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat. Tonight had confirmed his suspicions. But what he had seen was worse than he had anticipated. This wasn't a case of a few inattentive employees. It was a systemic issue, embedded in the culture of the restaurant. The quiet dismissal of James and Eleanor Carter wasn't an accident, it was an unspoken rule. As he reached the curb, Richard pulled out his phone and dialed Michael Hayes, his longtime assistant and trusted confidant. The call was answered within seconds. "I need a full report on customer complaints from the past 6 months," Richard said, keeping his voice low. "Everything, online reviews, internal records, anything that's been buried." There was a brief pause before Michael responded. "I assume this has to do with what you saw tonight." "It's exactly what I thought," Richard said, "and it's been going on longer than we realized." "I'll get on it," Michael replied. "Give me a few hours." Richard ended the call and hailed a cab. As he slid into the backseat, he gazed out at the city's glowing skyline, his mind already racing through possibilities. If favoritism in service had become standard practice, how deep did it go? And more importantly, who had allowed it to happen? Back at his apartment, Richard poured himself a glass of water and settled into his leather chair, waiting for Michael's call. It came just before midnight. "You're going to want to see this," Michael said, his voice carrying a note of unease. "There's a pattern." "Go on," Michael exhaled. "I found over 24 complaints that never made it past middle management. Customers reporting the exact same issue, being overlooked in favor of wealthier guests. Reservations mysteriously disappearing if a high-profile client wanted the table. Wait times stretching past an hour while others were seated immediately." Richard leaned forward. "How far back does this go?" "At least a year. But here's the real problem. A few employees tried to report it internally. Every single one of them either quit or was let go within weeks." Richard's grip on the glass tightened. He had built Le Grand Luxe on the promise of excellence, not just in cuisine, but in service. If a culture of discrimination had taken root under his watch, it meant someone had made a deliberate effort to keep him in the dark. "Who handled those complaints?" he asked. "Mostly mid-level managers, but the common thread is David Langston," Michael said. "He personally signed off on every dismissal." Richard had suspected as much. Langston had been hired years ago, a seasoned hospitality executive who had always been efficient, even if he was somewhat selective in his priorities. Now, it seemed that selectiveness had turned into something more insidious. "Start making calls," Richard instructed. "I want to talk to current employees, especially anyone who's hesitant to speak up." "Already ahead of you," Michael said. "There's one person who might be willing to talk. A server named Emma. She's been at Le Grand Luxe for a year, and she was the only one tonight who looked like she wanted to help that couple." Richard recalled the brief moment when Emma had stepped forward, only to be silenced by Langston. That hesitation wasn't fear, it was conscience. "See if she's willing to meet," he said, "and don't let her know who she's talking to just yet." The next afternoon, Michael arranged a meeting with Emma at a small cafe a few blocks from the restaurant. She was young, maybe in her mid-20s, and looked nervous as she stirred her coffee. Michael had introduced himself simply as a consultant for the company, gauging employee experiences. At first, Emma was hesitant, choosing her words carefully. "I don't want to get in trouble," she said. Michael nodded. "I understand, but if there's something wrong, it won't change unless someone speaks up." Emma hesitated, glancing at the door before lowering her voice. "It's not just how we treat customers," she admitted. "There's a list." Michael's brow furrowed. "A list?" Emma nodded. "David Langston keeps it. It's not official, but we all know it exists. It ranks customers based on their status. If you're not on the preferred list, you're invisible." Richard, listening in via a discreet earpiece, leaned back in his chair. This wasn't just a manager's personal bias, this was a structured system. Emma bit her lip. "Some of us don't like it, but if we push back, we get written up, or worse." Michael slid a napkin across the table. "Write down what you know. No names, just details." Emma hesitated, then picked up the pen. Richard didn't need to see what she wrote. He already knew this was bigger than he had thought. Richard Grant sat in his office, staring at the city skyline through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The sun had barely risen, casting a pale glow over Manhattan. But he had been awake for hours. What Emma had revealed was troubling. But it wasn't enough. He needed proof. Something undeniable. He reached for his phone and called Michael Hayes. The line clicked almost immediately. "I need you to access the restaurant's reservation system," Richard said. "Find out if this list Emma mentioned actually exists." Michael didn't hesitate. "Give me an hour." While he waited, Richard reviewed past reports on Le Grand Lux. The restaurant had always prided itself on exclusivity, but he had never authorized a ranking system that actively turned away customers. If this was happening under his leadership, then someone had taken liberties he had never approved. And there was only one person with the authority to enforce such a policy, David Langston. Michael called back sooner than expected. "It's worse than we thought." Richard leaned forward. "Tell me." "I found it," Michael said. "It's embedded in the reservation software but hidden under a separate access code. Took some digging, but I cracked it." Richard listened as Michael explained the classification system. Customers were divided into 3 categories. VIP Diamond. These were the untouchables, high-profile figures. Corporate executives, celebrities, and government officials. They were guaranteed immediate seating, the best tables, and personal service from the head chef if requested. Preferred. These were the regulars, well off but not in the same league as the VIPs. They received priority seating but weren't always guaranteed the best spots. Standard. The lowest tier. Walk-ins, first-time guests, or anyone who didn't meet the unspoken financial threshold. These customers were often made to wait, ignored, or in some cases, discreetly turned away during peak hours. Richard exhaled slowly, his grip tightening around his pen. "Is there any official documentation?" "That's the thing," Michael said. "There's no policy on record. Nothing in the employee handbook. Nothing sent to corporate. It's completely off the books." That meant Langston had orchestrated this himself. "There's more," Michael added. "I found a few flagged employee files, people who complained about this system. One of them wrote an internal report 6 months ago. 3 weeks later, he was let go. Official reason? Performance issues. But I checked his records, his reviews were spotless until then." Richard's jaw clenched. "And Langston approved the termination?" "Every single one," Michael confirmed. A long silence stretched between them. Richard had always trusted his managers to uphold the restaurant's values. He had built Le Grand Lux on the idea that luxury should be about experience, not just money. But what Langston had created was something else entirely, a business model built on exclusion. "Keep looking," Richard said. "There has to be more." Michael hesitated. "I already found it." Richard waited. "I pulled emails," Michael said. "Langston has been sending directives to his management team. Listen to this." He read aloud. "We don't have room for guests who don't bring value to the brand. If they're not buying premium wine or booking private rooms, they're not worth our time." Richard let the words settle, a cold weight pressing against his chest. This wasn't just favoritism. This was manipulation. Business designed to manufacture an illusion of exclusivity at the cost of basic service. He tapped his fingers against his desk, considering his next move. If Langston had implemented this without permission, Richard could fire him, but that wouldn't be enough. The culture wouldn't change unless he dismantled it from the inside out. "I'm going back," Richard said finally. "To the restaurant?" Michael asked. "Yes," Richard said, "but this time, they'll know exactly who I am." Richard Grant sat in the backseat of a town car, staring out at the illuminated skyline as he neared Le Grand Lux. The restaurant was in full swing, its golden glow spilling onto the sidewalk, where a line of luxury cars idled as valets in crisp uniforms hurried back and forth. He had been here just nights ago as an observer. Tonight, he had returned to make himself known. Emma had placed the reservation under a different name, just as he had requested. It was a test, one final confirmation of everything he already knew. He stepped out of the car and walked inside, moving past a couple who had just been turned away by the hostess. The young woman at the front podium barely glanced up before speaking. "Do you have a reservation?" "Yes," Richard said, "under the name William Carter." She checked her screen, her expression neutral until she found the entry. Her eyes flickered with hesitation. "I'm sorry, sir, but it looks like there's a slight wait." Richard glanced over her shoulder. Several open tables sat untouched, perfectly set, waiting. He tilted his head slightly. That's odd. The restaurant doesn't appear full. The hostess's smile didn't falter, but there was a stiffness to it now. We're currently prioritizing guests with premium seating arrangements. Before he could respond, the heavy glass door swung open, and a well-dressed couple strode inside. The man, his tailored suit perfectly fitted, barely acknowledged the staff as the hostess immediately brightened. "Mr. Calloway, welcome back," she said, her voice warming as she motioned for a server to take their coats. "Your table is ready." Richard watched as they were led past the waiting area and directly into the private dining section. His fingers tapped lightly against the podium. "I see," he murmured. A deep voice cut through the room. "Is there a problem here?" David Langston had entered from the side, his presence commanding, his sharp eyes landing on Richard with casual disinterest. He took a slow step forward, glancing at the reservation list before returning his gaze to the man in front of him. "There seems to be some confusion," Richard said, keeping his voice even. "I made a reservation, yet I've been told to wait. Meanwhile, others are seated immediately. I'd like to know why." David exhaled as if this conversation was beneath him. "We accommodate our guests based on their loyalty to Le Grand Luxe," he said smoothly. "Not all reservations hold the same priority." Richard's lips curved into a slow, knowing smile. "So you're saying you discriminate based on perceived value?" David's jaw twitched, but his voice remained controlled. "I wouldn't phrase it that way." "How would you phrase it, then?" Richard asked. David let out a low chuckle. "Sir, I don't know who you are, but I can assure you, Le Grand Luxe does not operate on a first-come, first-served basis. Now, if you'd like to continue waiting, you're welcome to do so." Richard studied him for a moment, then reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his phone. Without hesitation, he pressed a contact and held it to his ear. "Good evening, Laura," he said when the call connected. "I need you to make an announcement." David's brows furrowed. "Who exactly do you think you're calling?" Richard said nothing. A moment later, the overhead speakers crackled to life. "Attention, staff of Le Grand Luxe." A female voice rang through the dining hall. "Please be advised that Richard Grant, owner and founder of this establishment, is currently present in the building." A ripple of stunned silence passed through the restaurant. Conversations stuttered, silverware paused midair, and all eyes turned toward the man standing at the front. David Langston had gone pale. Richard slipped his phone back into his pocket, his expression unreadable. "Now," he said, his voice carrying through the room, "would you like to explain why my reservation was not honored?" David opened his mouth, then closed it again. His usually polished demeanor cracked, just slightly, before he quickly recovered. "There must have been a mistake." "Stop," Richard said simply. "We both know it wasn't a mistake." He turned his gaze to the staff members scattered around the room, many of whom now stood frozen in place. "I want every employee here, from the kitchen to the front of house, gathered in 5 minutes," he announced. "We're going to have a conversation about how this restaurant operates." Murmurs spread through the dining area. Guests whispered to one another, intrigued by the unfolding drama. Some looked uncomfortable, others fascinated, a few even reached for their phones, no doubt ready to capture the moment. David's hands clenched at his sides, his breath measured, but the flicker of panic in his eyes did not go unnoticed. Richard gave him a cool look. "I'd like to hear your justification, David," he said, "for the system you put in place, for the employees you silenced, for the customers you deemed unworthy." David exhaled through his nose, struggling to maintain his composure. Richard took a step closer. "Let's see how you explain that." Silence fell over Le Grand Luxe like a heavy curtain. The murmur of conversations had ceased, the clinking of glasses and silverware forgotten. Every eye in the room was fixed on Richard Grant, the man they had unknowingly dismissed just moments ago. David Langston stood frozen, his carefully constructed composure cracking at the edges. His fingers twitched at his sides, his jaw clenched so tightly it looked as if he were grinding his teeth. The realization had hit him like a freight train. This wasn't just an upset customer demanding better service. This was the owner of the entire chain, the very man who could end his career with a single word. The staff exchanged stunned glances. their expressions ranging from shock to quiet horror. Emma, standing near the back of the room, covered her mouth with her hands. Her eyes darted between Richard and David, as if trying to piece together how the man they had all ignored was now the most powerful figure in the building. Richard let the silence stretch, allowing the weight of the moment to settle before he spoke again. His voice was calm, measured, but there was an edge beneath it that made the air feel charged. "I want every employee in this building gathered right now," he said. "We need to have a discussion." The staff hesitated, unsure whether to move until Richard's gaze met Emma's. She gave a small nod and quickly turned, motioning for the others to follow. Within minutes, servers, hosts, kitchen staff, and managers had assembled at the front of the restaurant, their faces a mixture of apprehension and curiosity. The customers, still seated at their tables, leaned forward, eager to witness whatever was about to unfold. Richard turned to face David. "Would you like to explain, in your own words, the system you've been running here?" David exhaled through his nose. Lifting his chin, he straightened his cuffs, attempting to regain control of the situation. "I don't know what you mean." Richard didn't blink. "I'm referring to the classification system. The one that prioritizes high-spending clients and deliberately pushes away those deemed less valuable." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Employees shifted uncomfortably, while a few guests exchanged knowing glances. David scoffed. "I was simply implementing strategies to maintain the exclusivity of Le Grand Luxe. We're an elite establishment. We cater to a specific clientele." Richard nodded slightly, as if considering the words. Then, he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out his phone. With a few taps, he pulled up an email and turned the screen toward the crowd. "This is an internal memo," he announced, sent from David Langston to his managerial staff. He read aloud. A collective gasp spread across the restaurant. Some employees stiffened, others looked down, as if ashamed. Richard turned the screen so David could see it. "Did you send this?" David's expression barely flickered. "That was taken out of context." Richard swiped to another message. "Here's another one. This one instructs staff to delay seating for standard tier customers so that VIP clients always have a table available." He let the words hang in the air. The room felt smaller now, suffocating under the weight of the truth. A man seated near the bar suddenly stood. He was in his early 50s, dressed in a well-tailored suit, but his expression was one of betrayal. "I'm a regular here," he said, "and I never knew about this. How many times have I watched people being turned away, assuming it was just bad luck? Turns out, it was never luck at all." More whispers filled the air. David's eyes flicked to the exit, as if calculating whether he could simply walk out of this. But Richard wasn't finished. "This list you created," Richard continued, his voice carrying authority, "is not part of Le Grand Luxe's policies. You did this on your own. You manipulated the brand, altered the experience, and drove away customers who deserved better." David took a slow breath, his tone shifting. "With all due respect, sir, I was doing what needed to be done. Do you really think this restaurant would maintain its reputation if we treated everyone the same? High-spending clients expect priority. That's how the industry works." Richard's gaze didn't waver. "And you thought the best way to accomplish that was to make regular guests feel invisible?" David's mouth opened, but no words came out. He knew there was no right answer. Richard let the silence settle before delivering his final decision. "Effective immediately. You are suspended from your position, pending a full investigation." David's face drained of color. "You can't be serious," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I am," Richard said, his tone unwavering. More murmurs spread through the crowd. A few employees exchanged glances of quiet relief. David's hands clenched into fists at his sides. He stepped forward, lowering his voice so that only Richard could hear. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "You think you can just waltz in here and undo everything I built? You're about to realize that not everyone likes your version of fairness." Richard met his stare without flinching. "That sounds like a threat." David smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "It's a promise." Without another word, he turned on his heel and walked briskly toward the exit, disappearing through the front doors. The moment he was gone, the tension in the room seemed to break, replaced by hushed conversations and stolen glances between employees. Richard exhaled, pushing aside the weight of David's warning. He turned back to the staff. There will be a full meeting tomorrow. Every policy, every practice will be reviewed. If anyone has concerns, now is the time to speak. The employees hesitated, but Emma, standing near the back, took a step forward. Sir, she said quietly, there's something you should see. She held out a sealed envelope, her fingers gripping the edges tightly. Richard took it and opened it carefully. Inside, he found a series of financial statements, documents detailing questionable transactions linked directly to David Langston. Emma swallowed hard. I don't know what it means. But, if you're looking for the truth, I think this is part of it. Richard studied the papers, the implications settling in. David's corruption ran deeper than just favoritism. This was only the beginning. Richard Grant sat at his desk, the city lights of Manhattan flickering beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows of his office. The envelope Emma had handed him lay open in front of him. Its contents spread across the polished wood surface. A stack of financial reports, some official, others clearly pulled from internal records, revealed a troubling pattern. He picked up the first page, scanning the numbers with a practiced eye. Something was off. The figures for VIP revenue had surged over the past year, while general customer sales had seen an unexplained decline. That made no sense. Foot traffic hadn't changed, and the restaurant's overall reputation remained strong. He flipped to the next sheet, and that's when he saw it. A series of payments labeled as operational bonuses. Each transaction was directed to a company named Meridian Consulting. The name was unfamiliar, but the pattern was clear. The payments were consistent, occurring every month like clockwork. And the sums weren't insignificant, tens of thousands of dollars flowing out of Legrand Lux's accounts. Richard picked up his phone and dialed Michael Hayes. The call connected almost immediately. What do you need? I have a company name, Richard said, keeping his voice steady. Meridian Consulting. I need to know who owns it and what they do. Michael was silent for a moment. Then Richard heard the sound of typing in the background. Give me a second. Richard leaned back, eyes still fixed on the documents in front of him. If these payments were legitimate, they should be tied to a vendor or service provider. But something about the secrecy, the fact that the records had been buried, told him otherwise. Michael let out a low whistle. Well, that didn't take long. Meridian Consulting is officially registered under a man named Andrew Vaughn. Should I know him? You probably don't, Michael said, but David Langston does. Vaughn is an old friend of his. They worked together at another restaurant group years ago before Langston came here. Looks like Meridian was incorporated right around the time Langston was promoted to general manager. Richard exhaled through his nose. So Langston sets up a shell company under a friend's name, then starts funneling money into it through Legrand Lux. That's what it looks like, Michael confirmed. And here's the kicker. Meridian Consulting doesn't seem to actually do anything. No employees, no office space, no website. It's just a name on paper, collecting deposits. Richard felt a slow anger building in his chest. Langston hadn't just been manipulating the restaurant's service model, he had been profiting from it. How much money are we talking about? Richard asked. Michael typed for another few seconds before answering. If these payments have been happening every month, we're looking at close to $500,000 over the last 2 years. Richard clenched his jaw. Find out if any other transactions link back to Vaughn. If Langston was siphoning money, he might not have been acting alone. On it, Michael said. Richard ended the call and rubbed a hand over his face. The deeper he dug, the more rotten the system appeared. Langston wasn't just enforcing an elitist service structure, he was using it to launder money. And if he had gone this far, there was a good chance someone else was benefiting from it, too. He needed to know who. That thought led him back to Emma. Later that evening, Richard met her in a small cafe a few blocks from Legrand Lux. She looked uneasy, hands wrapped around a cup of tea, her eyes darting around as if she expected someone to be watching. Thank you for meeting me, Richard said as he sat down across from her. Emma gave a small nod. I don't know how much I can really help, but I want to do the right thing. Richard studied her for a moment before speaking. I need to know if you've ever overheard David Langston talking about Meridian Consulting. She frowned. No, that name doesn't sound familiar. Richard wasn't surprised. If Langston had been careful, he wouldn't have discussed it openly. What about any unusual conversations? Anything that felt off? Emma hesitated, then took a slow breath. There was one time, a few weeks ago, I walked into the back office and heard David on the phone. He was talking to someone about keeping certain clients happy. He said something like, "We take care of them. They take care of us." And then he mentioned something about making sure the right people got their share. Richard's stomach tightened. Did he say who he was talking to? She shook her head. No, but he sounded different. Not like he was just talking to another manager. More like he was answering to someone. Richard absorbed that information carefully. Langston had been running his own scheme. But it was beginning to sound like he was just one piece of a larger puzzle. "Emma," he said, his voice low, "if anything else comes to mind, anything at all, I need you to tell me. This isn't just about bad service anymore. There's money involved, lots of it." She swallowed hard. "Okay, I understand." Richard nodded, but his mind was already moving to the next step. He had to go bigger. The following morning, an internal memo was sent to every Le Grand Luxe location. It was short, direct, and left no room for misinterpretation. Effective immediately, all financial transactions will be reviewed. Any inconsistencies must be reported to corporate. Further instructions to follow. Within an hour of that memo going out, Richard's phone rang. A blocked number. He answered. Silence greeted him at first. Then a voice, low and deliberate. "You don't know what you're getting yourself into. Stop now, before it's too late." The call ended before Richard could respond. He lowered the phone slowly, exhaling through his nose. Whoever was behind this wasn't just worried. They were scared. That meant he was finally getting close. The fallout was immediate. Richard Grant sat in his office, watching as reports from various Le Grand Luxe locations flooded in. The moment his internal audit was announced, panic had spread through the company like wildfire. Some managers had begun purging data from their systems, erasing records before investigators could get to them. Others, particularly those with nothing to hide, hesitated, torn between loyalty to their employer and fear of retaliation. Then, just 24 hours into the investigation, one of the company's flagship restaurants abruptly shut down. No warning, no explanation. Richard turned to Michael Hayes, who had just finished a tense phone call. That was the district manager. Michael said, his voice tight. "The staff showed up this morning to find the doors locked. The general manager resigned overnight, took his severance, and disappeared." Richard frowned. "Who approved the closure?" "No one," Michael said, "at least, not officially." Richard's fingers tapped against his desk as he processed the implications. Someone was scrambling to cover their tracks. The timing was too convenient. A sharp ping from his computer drew his attention. A new email, no sender listed, subject line blank. He clicked it open, scanning the short message. "You are being watched. They know what you're doing. Don't trust anyone." Richard exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing. He forwarded the email to Michael. "Trace the source," he ordered, "and check our security logs. I want to know if anyone has accessed our internal systems without authorization." Michael nodded and turned back to his laptop, his fingers flying over the keys. Richard leaned back in his chair. The further he pushed, the more resistance he encountered. First, David Langston's corrupt system. Then, the discovery of Meridian Consulting. And now, an entire branch of his company had effectively gone dark overnight. This wasn't just about one man's greed. There was a network at play, one that had existed long before Richard started asking questions. A soft knock on the office door broke his thoughts. Emma stepped inside, her expression troubled. "Something's wrong," she said, crossing the room. "Managers are quitting, not just the ones caught in the investigation, but others, too. People who have been with the company for years." Richard folded his hands. "Do you think they're involved?" Emma hesitated. "I don't know, but it feels like they know something. Like they don't want to be here when it all comes crashing down." Richard studied her for a moment. If David wasn't the one truly running this, who was? Emma swallowed. "I don't know, but if this goes deeper than just one restaurant, maybe it goes higher up, too." Before Richard could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at the screen. An unexpected name flashed across it. "Philip Holloway." Richard answered. "Philip." The chairman's voice was smooth, practiced. "Richard, I've been meaning to call you. It seems you've been busy. Richard didn't bother with pleasantries. I assume you've seen the audit reports. I have, Philip confirmed, which is why I wanted to speak with you directly. You need to stop. Richard's grip on the phone tightened. Excuse me? Philip sighed. I understand your concerns, but this isn't the way to handle them. We can't let this spiral into a scandal. Le Grand Luxe is a household name. If the public catches wind of this, it could do irreversible damage to the brand. So, you want me to sweep it under the rug? I want you to be practical. Philip said, resolve this internally. Find the guilty parties, cut them loose, and move on, but do not take this public. Richard exhaled through his nose. And what if I don't? There was a pause. Then, Philip's voice dropped to something colder. Then you may find that you're not as untouchable as you think. The line went dead. Richard lowered the phone, his pulse steady but his thoughts racing. Philip Holloway wasn't just trying to contain the situation, he was protecting something. The question was, what? Before he could dwell on it, Michael's voice broke the silence. Richard, he said, his face pale as he stared at his laptop screen. You need to see this. He turned the screen toward Richard. A headline had just been published from a business news outlet. Le Grand Luxe CEO under scrutiny for financial manipulation. Richard's stomach sank. He skimmed the article, his name appearing multiple times alongside accusations that he had been using company funds for personal gain. This is a hit piece, Michael said, his voice laced with anger. Every claim is vague, but they're planting the idea that you're the one who's corrupt. Richard leaned back, jaw tightening. Someone had moved fast. The moment he turned his attention to the company's finances, a counterattack had been launched. They're trying to turn the narrative against you, Michael said. Whoever's behind this wants to make you the villain before you can expose the real story. Richard stared at the screen, his mind sharpening. This wasn't just an internal problem anymore. The fight had gone public. The storm hit fast. Richard Grant had dealt with crises before, but nothing like this. The article had spread like wildfire, dominating business headlines and feeding the gossip columns. Within hours, his inbox was flooded with messages, some from allies offering cautious support, others from board members demanding answers. Public perception shifted almost immediately. Social media exploded with debates over whether he was the visionary CEO being framed or just another executive caught in his own scandal. Then came the real damage. A meeting was called that same evening, an emergency session with the board of directors. The timing was no coincidence. Someone wanted to strike while the backlash was at its peak. Richard sat at the long mahogany table in the executive conference room, facing the men and women who had once been his colleagues, some even his friends. Now, many of them avoided his gaze. The tension in the room was thick, the air heavy with unspoken accusations. Philip Holloway sat at the far end, his hands folded neatly in front of him. He was calm, composed, every inch the seasoned corporate leader. Richard had known Philip for years, had respected his judgment, even considered him an ally. But tonight, something felt different. The situation has escalated beyond internal affairs, Philip said, his voice even. Investors are concerned. Shareholders are asking questions. The board must take action to protect the company's interests. Richard kept his expression neutral. Protect the company, or protect certain individuals? Philip didn't flinch. This isn't personal, Richard. Isn't it? Richard pressed. That article didn't appear out of nowhere. Someone planted it, and now you're using it as justification to remove me. A murmur passed through the room, but Philip remained unshaken. David Langston has made public allegations against you. Richard exhaled slowly, his fingers curling into fists beneath the table. Langston is a disgraced manager who was caught running an illegal system under my name. You expect me to believe his word holds weight now? Philip steepled his fingers. Public perception doesn't care about nuance. His story is damaging, whether it's true or not. Richard glanced around the room. Some faces looked uncertain, others carefully blank, but a few, particularly those who had always stood by Philip, were watching him with something else in their eyes. Resignation. They had already made their decision. The vote came quickly. A handful of board members hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the speed of it all. But in the end, the result was decisive. By a narrow majority, Richard Grant was suspended as CEO of Legrand Lux for a period of 30 days. Pending further investigation. He wasn't naive. He knew what this was. 30 days wasn't just a suspension, it was a setup for permanent removal. Philip stood as the meeting concluded, adjusting his cufflinks. "This is the best course of action for now," he said, his tone carefully measured. "Take some time away. Let the situation cool." Richard held his gaze. "You're making a mistake." Philip smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "I hope that's not the case." Richard left the building without another word. Outside, the night was cold, the city streets buzzing with life. He had just lost control of his own company. His reputation was under siege. And someone, maybe Philip, maybe someone else, was moving against him with precision. As he walked toward his car, a familiar voice called his name. Emma stood near the curb, clutching something small in her hands. Her expression was tense, but there was something else in her eyes. Determination. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "I have something you need to hear." She pressed a USB drive into his palm. Richard studied her. "What is it?" "A recording," she whispered. "I found it in David Langston's office before he left. It's him talking to someone higher up. They weren't just running a customer ranking system. They were using Legrand Lux for something else. Something bigger." Richard felt a chill run through him. Who was he talking to? Emma hesitated. "I don't know, but if you listen to this, you might." Richard nodded. "Thank you." She glanced over her shoulder, as if sensing they were being watched. "Be careful," she said. "Whoever did this to you, they're not done yet." Richard pocketed the USB and turned toward his car. His phone buzzed in his pocket. An unknown number. He hesitated, then answered. A voice, low and deliberate, spoke into his ear. "If you release that recording, you'll lose everything." Richard stood motionless for a moment, the weight of the threat settling over him. Then his phone buzzed again. A banking alert. His personal accounts had just been frozen. He stared at the screen, his heartbeat steady but his mind racing. Whoever was behind this didn't just want him out of the company. They wanted to destroy him completely. Richard Grant sat at his kitchen table, a half-empty cup of coffee growing cold beside him. The city outside his window was already awake, but he felt as if he were moving in slow motion. His phone screen still displayed the banking alert from the night before. His personal accounts were frozen. And now, his business transactions had been halted as well. Michael Hayes called just as he was about to check for updates. "It's worse than we thought," Michael said, skipping pleasantries. "The SEC has launched an investigation into you." Richard's stomach clenched. "On what grounds?" "Allegations of financial manipulation," Michael said grimly. "Someone filed a complaint that you were misrepresenting earnings and moving money through shell companies. The timing is too perfect. This was planned." Richard exhaled slowly. It wasn't enough for them to push him out of Legrand Lux. They were making sure he couldn't fight back. A knock at the door startled him. He opened it to find Emma, her expression tight with worry. "Have you seen the news?" she asked. Richard nodded. "Let me guess. The board made it official. They're calling it a necessary step to restore public trust," she said, pulling out her phone and playing a news clip. Philip Holloway stood at a podium, cameras flashing. His voice was measured, the perfect balance of concern and control. "Given the ongoing financial concerns, the board of Legrand Lux has made the difficult decision to revoke Richard Grant's authority as CEO. We will conduct a full audit to ensure transparency and accountability." Richard set his jaw. He knew corporate damage control when he saw it. Holloway was positioning himself as the savior of the company, making it clear that Richard was the problem. Then came another clip. David Langston. Despite being suspended, he was seated across from a well-known journalist, playing the role of the victim. "I was just following company directives," Langston said. "I thought I was implementing the policies given to me. But now, I see that I was being used." The journalist leaned forward. "So, you're saying Richard Grant personally ordered the customer ranking system?" Langston sighed, shaking his head. "I don't want to speculate. But I will say this. When you work in an environment where certain expectations are set, you learn to follow the rules, even if you don't agree with them." Richard let out a bitter laugh. "Unbelievable." Emma's hands curled into fists. "He's lying." "Of course he is." Richard muttered. But it doesn't matter. He's saying just enough to cast doubt. And doubt is all they need. His phone rang again. This time, it was a name he had expected. Laura Bennett. The moment he answered, the corporate lawyer wasted no time. Richard, you're running out of moves. He rubbed his temple. Tell me something I don't know. The SEC investigation isn't just about frozen accounts. Laura said, some of your financial records have been altered. Transactions that were perfectly legal now look questionable. Whoever did this wants to make sure you don't just lose your company. They want to ruin you. Richard closed his eyes for a second. Can we prove the records were changed? Laura hesitated. It depends. If we can find the original data before it was manipulated, we have a case. But if the digital trail has been wiped, then all that's left is the version that makes you look guilty. Richard opened his laptop. He pulled up the company's internal database, searching for the original transaction logs. Within seconds, a red error message flashed across his screen. Access denied. Files unavailable. Richard set his jaw. They're already covering their tracks. Michael, who had been listening over speakerphone, spoke up. There has to be a way to track who altered the files. Someone on the inside did this. Emma's eyes widened. Wait, I remember something. Richard turned to her. What is it? Langston used to talk about a man who handled all the financial adjustments for him. A senior accountant. He always made it sound like this guy was his safety net. The one person who could make sure nothing got traced back to him. Richard leaned forward. Do you remember his name? Emma frowned, thinking. Then she nodded. Paul Whitaker. Michael started typing. Within moments, he cursed under his breath. That's not good. Richard braced himself. What? Paul Whitaker left town 3 days ago. Michael said. No forwarding address. No known location. Just vanished. Silence settled over the room. Richard's phone buzzed again. Another unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something told him he should. He pressed the button and lifted it to his ear. A low voice, calm but filled with quiet menace, spoke. Don't look for him. Richard's grip tightened on the phone. Who is this? The caller ignored the question. Paul Whitaker is gone. Soon, you will be too. Richard set the phone down carefully. His pulse was steady, but he could feel the walls closing in. This wasn't just a corporate takedown anymore. Someone was making sure there was no way back. Richard Grant had always prided himself on staying ahead of the game. Anticipating moves before they happened. Seeing patterns others overlooked. But now, for the first time in his career, he felt like he was running out of time. The pressure was closing in from every direction. His accounts were frozen. His name dragged through the mud. And the SEC breathing down his neck. If he didn't find irrefutable proof of his innocence, and fast, his career, his legacy, and possibly his freedom would be gone. Michael Hayes leaned over his laptop, his fingers moving rapidly over the keyboard. There might be a way to recover the deleted data, he said, his voice tense. The company servers automatically back up financial records every 24 hours. But they're stored in a secondary system. Richard's pulse quickened. Can we access them? Michael exhaled. Not without help. Richard already knew what that meant. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he hadn't used in years. Daniel Carter answered on the second ring. It's been a while. Richard, I need your help, Richard said. There was a pause. Then a quiet chuckle. It must be serious if you're calling me. Daniel Carter was a former cybersecurity expert who had once worked with government agencies before turning independent. Now, he ran a private security firm that specialized in uncovering digital fraud and recovering compromised data. If anyone could retrieve what had been erased, it was him. I'll send you what I have, Michael said, forwarding the corrupted files to Daniel's secure server. I'll see what I can do. Daniel replied, give me an hour. But before they could even catch their breath, trouble arrived. A commotion outside the office drew their attention. Richard moved to the window and cursed under his breath. A group of reporters had gathered in front of the building, cameras flashing as they swarmed the entrance. Then came the breaking news banner flashing across the television in the corner of the room. Former CEO Richard Grant under federal investigation. Financial crimes could lead to prison. Laura Bennett walked in just as the segment began. She took one look at the screen and shook her head. They're trying to bury you before you can fight back, she said. Richard clenched his fists. They're painting me as the villain. That's the point, Laura said. If public perception turns completely against you, no one will believe whatever evidence we uncover. Michael's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. Daniel's got something. They crowded around as Daniel's face appeared on a video call. I managed to pull something, he said, his voice calm but urgent. It's an email thread from months ago, between David Langston and Philip Holloway. Richard's stomach tightened. What does it say? Daniel sent the recovered email to their screens. It was clear, undeniable. Philip Holloway had known about the customer ranking system all along. Not only had he been aware, but he had also supported it, ensuring that the most profitable customers were prioritized while regular patrons were pushed aside. And worse, there was another discovery buried in the financial records. A hidden slush fund, used to quietly pay off select board members before Richard's ousting. They rigged the vote, Richard muttered. Michael exhaled sharply. Philip didn't just stab you in the back. He made sure the entire board turned against you before you even had a chance to defend yourself. Richard's jaw tightened. We need to get this out. Laura nodded. If we release this to the right people, Philip won't be able to hide. This could shift the entire narrative. But before they could move, Daniel's screen suddenly went black. A warning message flashed across his monitor. Unauthorized access detected. Files encrypted. Daniel cursed. They're in my system. Someone just remotely wiped the data. Then, a new message appeared on the screen. You can't win this, Richard. The room was silent for a moment. Michael ran a hand through his hair. That's it, then. It's gone. Richard felt the weight of defeat pressing against his ribs. The proof they needed had just been erased in real time. Whoever was behind this had the kind of power and reach that made fighting back nearly impossible. But then, Emma spoke. I have a copy. Everyone turned to her. She held up a USB drive. Gripping it tightly, I saved the email thread the moment Daniel recovered it. Just in case. Richard's breath caught. They weren't out of the fight yet. Richard Grant had spent his career mastering the art of control, anticipating problems before they escalated, staying one step ahead of his competitors. But now, for the first time, he was playing defense. The forces moving against him were coordinated, relentless, and dangerous. He knew that if he hesitated, even for a moment, he would lose everything. He stood in his apartment, the USB drive Emma had given him resting on the table. Laura Bennett and Michael Hayes sat across from him, both tense but determined. We can't just release this to the media and hope for the best, Laura said, arms crossed. If we go public too soon, Philip will frame it as a desperate move from a disgraced CEO. He'll discredit us before the truth can take hold. So, what's the plan? Michael asked. Richard picked up the drive, turning it over in his fingers. We go through official channels first. If we can get the federal regulators involved before Philip makes his next move, we'll have the law on our side. Laura nodded. We send this to the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. They have the authority to investigate corporate fraud at this level. If they find Philip guilty of financial misconduct, it won't matter how much power he has, he'll be finished. Michael pulled out his laptop. I'll draft the report now. But we also need to move fast. Philip isn't going to sit around waiting for this to play out. Richard exhaled. That's why I'm calling a meeting with the board members who haven't turned against me yet. If I can convince them of the truth before Philip solidifies his control, we might still have a chance to fight this from the inside. That evening, Richard arrived at a private club in Midtown Manhattan, where a handful of board members had agreed to meet. These were the men and women who hadn't openly sided with Philip, but they hadn't defended Richard either. The mood in the room was tense. No one wanted to be seen as taking sides too early. Richard wasted no time. He placed a set of printed documents in front of each board member, the recovered emails detailing Philip's knowledge of the customer ranking system, the hidden fund used to manipulate votes, and financial transactions leading back to his private accounts. This is the truth, Richard said, his voice steady. Philip Holloway orchestrated everything. He used David Langston as a pawn to implement the ranking system. And when the scandal broke, he turned it against me. Then, he bribed key members of this board to ensure my removal. Some members shifted uncomfortably in their seats. One of them, a longtime investor named Harold Price, cleared his throat. Even if this is true, going public with it could destroy Le Grand Luxe's reputation. The stock could plummet. The brand may never recover. Richard met his gaze. The brand won't survive under Philip. If we don't stop him now, this company will be nothing more than a front for his corruption. Another board member, Elizabeth Carter, tapped her fingers against the table. You're asking us to go against the man who now controls the company. No, Richard corrected. I'm asking you to do what's right. Silence hung in the air. Then, Harold exhaled. If you can prove to the regulators that Philip is guilty, I'll back you. Elizabeth nodded. So will I. Others murmured in agreement, though some remained hesitant. It wasn't an outright victory, but it was enough to shake Philip's control. As the meeting wrapped up, Michael's phone buzzed. He checked the message and his face went pale. We have a problem, he said. Philip just announced a press conference for tomorrow morning. The news spread fast. Philip Holloway was preparing to go public, not just as the new leader of Le Grand Luxe, but as the man who would restore the company's integrity. The press conference would be his chance to bury Richard for good. If he controls the media narrative first, Laura said, pacing the room, it won't matter what evidence we have. People will believe him. We need to get ahead of him. Richard said. Michael nodded. I know a journalist, Sarah Whitmore. She's independent, doesn't take corporate money, and has a reputation for exposing financial corruption. Can we trust her? Richard asked. If we give her the evidence and let her verify it herself, she'll run the story, Michael said. Philip won't be able to suppress it. Richard didn't hesitate. Do it. Michael sent the files, and within hours, an article broke online. The story was damning. It exposed the ranking system, Philip's financial manipulation, and his attempt to frame Richard. It was the kind of article that couldn't be ignored. As soon as the piece went live, Richard's phone rang. An unknown number. He answered, expecting Philip. Instead, a deep voice filled the line. You just made a very big mistake. Richard, you have no idea who you're up against. The call disconnected. Richard slowly lowered the phone. This fight wasn't over. The moment the article went live, the fallout was immediate. News outlets latched onto the scandal, dissecting every detail about Philip Holloway, David Langston, and the corrupt ranking system at Le Grand Luxe. Business analysts speculated about the company's future. While social media exploded with outrage, some called for Holloway's resignation, while others demanded a full federal investigation. The pressure was mounting. By midday, Philip Holloway abruptly canceled his scheduled press conference. Instead, he held a closed-door meeting with the most influential shareholders, undoubtedly trying to control the damage. Richard Grant watched from his apartment as the headlines scrolled across the television screen. He knew Philip was scrambling, but something felt off. The man had been too confident, too assured in his power. He had made moves that suggested he had the backing of something bigger than just corporate allies. Michael Hayes paced the room, phone in hand. I did some more digging, he said. The slush fund Philip and Langston used, it wasn't just to bribe board members. Richard frowned. Then where did the money go? Michael handed over his tablet. I traced several transactions through offshore accounts. Some of them lead to shell corporations that don't officially exist. And one name keeps popping up, Arcadia Holdings. Richard narrowed his eyes. Never heard of it. That's because it doesn't publicly exist, Michael said. On paper, it's a real estate investment firm. But when I cross-checked its financial activity, it operates more like a private equity firm that moves money in and out of questionable ventures. Laura Bennett leaned in, scanning the data. This is bigger than we thought. Richard exhaled slowly. Philip Holloway isn't the mastermind. He's just a piece on the board. Just then, his phone vibrated. It was Emma. I need to see you, she said. I found something. An hour later, Richard met Emma in a dimly lit coffee shop on the Lower East Side. She looked uneasy, her fingers gripping a flash drive as if it might disappear at any moment. I was digging through the internal servers at Le Grand Luxe, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I found something buried deep, hidden under outdated financial reports. It's a document linking Arcadia Holdings to direct financial transactions with our corporate accounts. Richard took the flash drive from her. This proves they've been funding the entire scheme? Emma nodded. It's more than that. The document shows signatures, people signing off on payments, approving the movement of money. Richard inserted the drive into his laptop. Pulling up the file, his breath caught as he read the names. Among them was Philip Holloway. But below it was a name he hadn't expected. Edwin Mercer. Richard felt a cold chill settle over him. Edwin Mercer was a billionaire financier with deep political and corporate ties. He wasn't just an investor, he was the kind of man who shaped industries from behind the scenes. If he was involved, this wasn't just about Le Grand Luxe anymore. Emma hesitated. Richard, do you know what this means? Richard's jaw tightened. Yeah, it means Philip is just a middleman. The real power is sitting in a boardroom somewhere, pulling the strings. Before they could discuss further, Michael called, his voice sharp with urgency. We have a problem. Richard arrived at his office to find the front door pried open. Inside, papers were scattered across the floor. Drawers pulled out, computer monitors smashed. Michael stood near his desk, staring at what was left of his laptop. They wiped everything, he muttered. Files are gone, hard drives destroyed. Laura arrived minutes later, her expression grave. This wasn't a warning. They were looking for something. Richard clenched his fists. They wanted the document. Michael exhaled. They think we only had one copy. Then Richard's phone buzzed. A text message from an unknown number. This is your final warning. Walk away, or you won't get another chance. Richard tightened his grip on the device, his mind already working through the next step. They thought they could scare him into submission. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Richard Grant gripped the steering wheel tighter, his pulse steady but his mind racing. The black SUV had been following him for at least 5 blocks. Maintaining a careful distance but never turning away. It wasn't a coincidence. Michael Hayes's voice crackled through the car's Bluetooth speaker. Richard, I've been tracking your GPS. That SUV's been tailing you since you left the office. Richard's jaw tightened. I noticed. He flicked his eyes toward the rearview mirror. The SUV wasn't speeding up, wasn't making any aggressive moves. Just watching, waiting. Whoever was inside wanted him to know they were there. Do I have a route out? Richard asked. Michael was silent for a second. Probably scanning a map. Take a left at the next intersection. Then another left down 52nd. There's a service road that runs behind the old hotel construction site. If they follow, we'll know for sure. Richard made the turn, keeping his movements smooth, natural. The SUV followed. No hesitation. No doubt. Michael cursed. It's them. Richard exhaled, forcing his voice to stay calm. Stay with Emma. Make sure she gets somewhere safe. I don't like this. Richard, if they wanted to intimidate you, they would have sent another text. This is something else. Richard knew Michael was right. This wasn't about scaring him anymore. He glanced at the phone screen mounted on his dashboard. Emma's last text glowed on the display. I have the files, but someone knows. She had managed to recover the document. But at what cost? Philip Holloway had made his threat crystal clear. Richard had expected retaliation, but not this fast. And not this direct. He had to lose the tail. Richard took another turn, this time sharper, into a quieter street with fewer cars. He pushed the gas, testing the SUV's reaction. It sped up. Richard clenched his teeth. He couldn't lead them to Emma. If they had figured out she was involved, she was already in danger. Michael's voice came through again. There's an underground parking garage 2 blocks ahead. It has 2 exits. If you time it right, you can lose them. Richard took a deep breath and accelerated, weaving through traffic. The SUV followed, its movements more aggressive now. They weren't just tracking him anymore. They were closing in. Richard reached the parking garage entrance and swerved in without slowing down. The moment his tires hit the concrete floor, he shut off his headlights and took a sharp right, disappearing behind a row of parked cars. The SUV barreled in after him. Richard waited, heart pounding, as he watched through the side mirror. The vehicle slowed, scanning the lot. Then, without hesitation, Richard hit the gas again, this time aiming for the secondary exit. He shot out onto the street, merging into traffic just as the SUV struggled to turn around. Michael's voice came through, breathless. Did you lose them? For now, Richard muttered. But they're getting bolder. Michael's tone turned grim. That means they're getting desperate. Richard didn't respond. He was already thinking about what came next. Philip Holloway had resources, but he wasn't the mastermind. The real threat, the one pulling the strings, had just revealed themselves. And Richard was going to find them. Richard Grant didn't drive straight to Emma's location. That would be too predictable. He knew whoever was behind the black SUV wouldn't give up so easily. Instead, he took an erratic route, weaving through different streets, making random turns to see if they would still follow. Michael Hayes' voice crackled through the car's Bluetooth. Take the next right. There's an alleyway that leads to a back street. You might be able to lose them there. Richard obeyed, pressing the gas pedal as he maneuvered sharply into a narrow alleyway between two tall brick buildings. For a brief moment, the SUV disappeared from his rearview mirror. But just as relief began to set in, a second vehicle, a sleek black sedan, turned into the alley from the opposite end, blocking his path. Richard's grip tightened on the steering wheel. He was trapped. Two men in dark suits stepped out of the car. Their movements slow, deliberate. One of them rapped his knuckles against Richard's driver's side window. His expression neutral but eyes sharp. "Mr. Grant," he said smoothly, "you've been given multiple warnings. We'd hate to see this situation escalate." Richard didn't flinch. "If you wanted to kill me, you wouldn't be wasting time talking." The man smirked. "Kill you? That would be unnecessary. Accidents happen all the time in this city. Maybe an unfortunate brake failure. Or a robbery gone wrong. You'd be surprised how unpredictable life can be." Richard met his gaze, unwavering. "If you knew anything about me, you'd know threats don't work." The second man, who had remained silent until now, took a step forward. "Then maybe you need a demonstration." Just as tension reached its peak, the distant sound of a police siren echoed through the alley. The two men exchanged glances. They weren't interested in public attention. Without another word, they turned, got back into their car, and drove off as if nothing had happened. But before leaving, the first man lowered his window and said, "This isn't over, Mr. Grant. You can't fight something you don't understand." Richard watched as the sedan vanished into the night. A moment later, Michael's voice returned. "Richard, are you okay? What happened?" "They sent people to deliver their message in person," Richard said, finally exhaling. "Whoever's behind this is getting nervous." Michael hesitated. "What now?" Richard pulled back onto the main road. "Now, we go on the offensive." He drove straight to Emma's apartment. The moment he stepped inside, she handed him the external hard drive. "Everything is on here," she said, her voice still carrying the adrenaline of the last few hours. Richard plugged the drive into his laptop. Laura Bennett watching over his shoulder as rows of numbers, names, and transactions filled the screen. Laura's eyes widened. This isn't just about Le Grand Luxe. She scrolled through the data, pointing to a series of high-value transactions made to offshore accounts. Each one linked back to a holding company that had remained hidden in previous investigations. Michael leaned in, squinting at the screen. "That name, Stratford Capital. They've been involved in multiple scandals. But nothing's ever stuck." Richard exhaled sharply. "Because they've always had people like Philip Holloway taking the fall for them." Laura nodded. "They don't just manipulate one industry. They're embedded across corporate finance, real estate, and high-end hospitality. This is bigger than we thought." Before they could analyze further, a breaking news alert flashed across the television in the corner of the room. Breaking news. Former Le Grand Luxe executive David Langston killed in car crash. The room fell silent. Emma covered her mouth. "He's dead?" Michael grabbed the remote, turning up the volume. The anchor continued. "Authorities say Langston's vehicle lost control at high speed before crashing into a guardrail. The cause of the accident is still under investigation." Emma shook her head. "This wasn't an accident." Richard narrowed his eyes. "No, this was an execution." David Langston's sudden death left little doubt in Richard Grant's mind. He was getting too close to something bigger than a simple corporate corruption case. Someone was tying up loose ends. Laura Bennett combed through the financial documents they had recovered, her sharp eyes catching details that had initially seemed insignificant. "These offshore transactions," she murmured, tapping at her screen, "they all funnel through a company called Blackwood Holdings." Michael Hayes pulled up additional records. Blackwood Holdings is a shell company. It's technically an investment firm, but in reality, It's a financial front for something else. And there's one name that keeps showing up, Victor Calloway. Richard leaned forward. He had heard that name before. Victor Calloway was no ordinary businessman. A billionaire with nearly no public footprint. He operated in the shadows, making power moves through intermediaries, never getting his hands dirty. His name whispered through back channels in Wall Street, linked to deals that vanished before investigators could catch wind of them. Michael exhaled. He's the real mastermind. Philip Holloway was just a tool. Richard stared at the screen. And now that we know about him, we're on borrowed time. Emma, who had been silent until now, spoke carefully. If Calloway is behind this, what's the next move? Richard's mind was already working. We don't just expose Philip Holloway anymore. We go after the entire network. Before he could elaborate, his laptop chimed. A new email notification. The sender was anonymous. The subject line was simple. I have information on Calloway. We need to meet. Richard opened the email, reading the short message inside. Calloway is moving fast. He's cleaning up. If you want proof, we don't have much time. I'll meet you at the Rustwood Tavern. Brooklyn, midnight. The name at the bottom of the email made Richard's pulse quicken. Daniel Morris. Michael looked over his shoulder. Morris used to be a senior accountant at Blackwood Holdings before he vanished 2 years ago. There were rumors he was planning to blow the whistle. But then he just disappeared. Richard tapped his fingers against the table. If this is legit, he could have the evidence we need to tie Calloway to the money laundering operation. Laura was less convinced. And if it's a setup? We're walking into the lion's den. Richard considered it for a moment. Then he closed his laptop. If I don't go, we'll never get the full picture. Michael looked uneasy. Then we need to have an exit plan. Hours later, Richard arrived at the Rustwood Tavern. The place was nearly empty, the dim light casting long shadows across the wooden floors. In the farthest booth, a man sat hunched over a glass, his face partially hidden under the brim of a baseball cap. Richard approached. Morris? The man lifted his gaze. Daniel Morris was thinner than Richard remembered from the few images he had seen, his face hollow. Eyes darting with paranoia. He nodded once. Sit. Richard did. You said you have something. Morris wiped a hand across his mouth, glancing toward the entrance. Calloway's getting ready to disappear. He's selling off Blackwood Holdings piece by piece, making sure nothing can be traced back to him. Once the last transfer is done, he'll be untouchable. Richard tensed. You have proof of this? Morris reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small USB drive. This has transaction logs, hidden ledgers that connect Calloway's network to Legrand Lux and other businesses he's been using to wash his money. Richard took the drive, but before he could react, a sudden crack split the air. A single gunshot. Morris's head snapped back, blood spraying across the table. His body slumped forward, the weight of it making the glass in front of him topple. Richard froze for half a second before instinct took over. He grabbed the USB drive and dove to the floor as another shot shattered the window behind him. Heart pounding, he spotted the shooter, a figure dressed in black, already slipping out the side door. Richard didn't chase. He knew better than that. Whoever had done this wasn't working alone. Morris was dead. And now, Richard was next on the list. After Daniel Morris's murder, Richard Grant knew there was no time left to hesitate. Victor Calloway wasn't just tying up loose ends, he was wiping out anyone who could expose him. Laura Bennett and Michael Hayes worked through the night, piecing together their next move. Calloway was preparing for a private meeting with elite investors, where he would finalize the sale of Blackwood Holdings. If the deal went through, he would disappear, taking his empire of corruption with him. Richard leaned over the table, his jaw set. We're not waiting anymore. We're going to take him down where he least expects it. Their plan was bold and risky. Richard would infiltrate the investor meeting using a falsified identity, while Michael and Laura monitored from a secure location. Emma, whose instincts had proven invaluable, would stay in the hotel lobby, ready to trigger their final move if anything went wrong. The evidence was their strongest weapon. The financial documents, the offshore transactions, and most crucially, the audio recording Emma had saved, the one where Calloway ordered Philip Holloway to cover up the money laundering operation. If they could reveal it at the right moment, They could turn Calloway's own investors against him and force the authorities to act before he erased all traces of his crimes. But if they failed, Calloway would destroy the evidence, disappear, and leave Richard to take the fall. The meeting was set in a high-security conference room at the Regent Hotel in Manhattan. Every attendee was carefully vetted, but Richard, posing as an international investor, managed to slip through. His heart pounded as he took his seat among a group of elite financiers, all waiting for Calloway to present his grand exit strategy. The man himself entered moments later. Victor Calloway exuded quiet dominance, his silver hair neatly combed, his suit immaculate. He greeted the investors with the charm of a seasoned manipulator, assuring them that Blackwood Holdings' transition would be smooth and profitable. Then, just as Calloway was preparing to unveil his final slide, Richard stood up. "Mr. Calloway," he said, his voice carrying across the silent room, "I think these investors deserve to see the full picture before they commit to anything." Richard pulled a small remote from his pocket and pressed a button. The main screen behind Calloway flickered. Instead of the polished financial projections he had prepared, lines of real, incriminating transactions filled the display. Transfers to offshore accounts, hidden slush funds, and then, the audio played. Philip Holloway's voice crackled through the speakers. "What do we do if someone digs too deep?" Calloway's voice followed, cold and unmistakable. "Then we make sure they don't get the chance to talk." The room erupted into chaos. Investors shot to their feet, voices rising in shock and outrage. Some of them had known Calloway played dirty. But this was different. This was criminal. Calloway's face remained impassive, but Richard saw the tightening of his jaw, the subtle flicker of calculation in his eyes. He was planning his next move. And then the doors burst open. FBI agents swarmed the room. Moving with practiced precision, a senior agent stepped forward. Badge raised. "Victor Calloway, you are under arrest for financial fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice." Calloway turned, prepared to walk away, but two agents closed in on him. For the first time, Richard saw something in his eyes other than control. Frustration. "You can't hold me," Calloway muttered as the cuffs locked around his wrists. "I have lawyers who..." The agent cut him off. "Your lawyers can't undo federal charges." Richard stepped closer, lowering his voice. "For the first time in your life, you can't buy your way out." As Calloway was led away, another update came in. Philip Holloway had been arrested at the Le Grand Lux headquarters. With Calloway out of the picture, the board of directors had turned on him in minutes, offering full cooperation with law enforcement. The empire had fallen. In the aftermath, the board reinstated Richard as CEO, giving him full authority to clean house. Emma, whose quick thinking had saved their case more than once, was promoted and placed in charge of ensuring ethical practices across the company. Sitting in his office, overlooking the streets of New York, Richard allowed himself a moment of quiet. Laura walked in, arms crossed. "You got your company back. What now?" Richard took a slow sip of his coffee, his expression unreadable. "Now," he said, "I find out what other secrets are still buried. At the end of the day, power isn't just about money or status, it's about responsibility." Richard Grant walked into his restaurant expecting a meal. But what he found was a system built on greed and corruption. Instead of looking the other way, he fought back, exposing the truth at great personal risk. His story is a reminder that real leadership isn't about standing at the top, it's about standing for what's right. What would you have done in his place? Let us know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths for more eye-opening stories like this one.